Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's so good to be talking to my friends, because even though you're watching this video 1 week after the previous one, I actually spent like 2 weeks filming this video. But let's take this one step at a time. So we have our Jagdtiger in 1/35 scale, and so far we painted it in the late war German ambush color scheme, and then we improved the surface with some basic techniques like pin washes, oil dot filters, and ambient occlusion / fake highlights and shadows. For those of you joining in just now, this is an ongoing series with 3 episodes before this, and a few more are gonna follow. So, if you're new here and don't wanna miss them out, just subscribe and you won't miss out on anything. Okay, so we're gonna start with some chipping. First, we need to mix a light sand color from these two. The initial layer of light chips is gonna be made using the sponge method. So here I have a piece of packaging foam clamped into an old pair of tweezers, and we just have to gently dip it into the paint. But before we touch the model, it's important to remove the excess paint on a piece of napkin until the sponge leaves just a faint trace and just a few dots. Now, we already used this technique several times on this channel, although I can only recall 2 occasions. One was definitely the Hutsche, so another German tank hunter, and the other was the Type 5 Cheery. Well, I'm a huge fan of brush painted chips, but from now on, my friends, we're gonna be exploring ways on how to paint chipping effects more easily and efficiently. Sponge method is definitely one of those methods which make our lives easier, because you can chip the entire model in a matter of minutes, of course depending on how large it is. This Jagdtiger took me about half an hour, which isn't bad at all, but there's of course a huge important but. The sponge method is, in like 9 cases out of 10, only good for the initial layup because it's quite random, which is a good thing on one hand, but on the other, when you need more control, it's just not quite there. This might be entirely about practice and dedication, and maybe there are some sponge Jedis out there, but for me, it's just the first step in a long list of techniques needed to get decent chipping results. And again, we're gonna be using this technique more frequently in the upcoming projects as well. Anyway, I'd say so far so good, but before we proceed to more detailed work, let's add more randomness with oil paints. Again, I need to mix a light sandy color, but this time I'll thin it to a lighter consistency than the previous paint. We're gonna be using the so-called speckling technique, and this means flicking the paint off the paintbrush. And this means always making sure the effect is to our liking. Just remove the excess paint from the brush on a napkin and then try the effect on a piece of paper. This technique is incredibly efficient because it's even faster than the sponge. But it's also easy to control, even if it doesn't seem like it at first. So this is all about adding hundreds and thousands of tiny droplets of paint on the surface, which are gonna represent small flakes and scuffs. The result can be adjusted by diluting the paint even more, and also by having more of it in the brush, in which case the result will be more of a mottled, faded look. Something like I did previously on the Crusader Mark III. Here I'm just focused on adding these tiny, barely visible chips, and if you want your model to look like it went through a war, this is definitely the way to go, because if we imagine the heat of a battle, there's always stuff flying around like, bullets, shrapnel, or debris, and this is exactly what it might do to a tank. However, just like the sponge method, this technique can be slightly unpredictable at times, but luckily, oil paints give us plenty of time to remove them or tone them down. For example, if they look too crisp, we can gently rub them with a completely dry brush, which will wipe away a small portion of the paint, making the result more subtle. Then, if there are any oversized or just unwanted specks, we can take a brush dipped in white spirit and wipe them away. There might be cases when you have multicolored tank like this and the light sand color can't be used in certain portions, such as the oxide primer strip where side skirts used to be, but because speckling only works in a certain way, the paint will land here as well. Again, super easy to remove, and I think it's far easier than masking the strip for this sole purpose. But okay, enough of random effects. Let's finally do some precision work. It's time for brush chipping, and that means using the same light sand color, but now it needs to be diluted perfectly. This means 10 drops of dark yellow from ammo, 3 decently sized drops of Vallejo white paint, 5 drops of VMS drying retarder, and that's actually it. No need to add tap water this time because the ammo paint is already thin enough on its own, and the VMS retarder also acts as a thinner and flow improver. And of course, we're gonna use the good old Vallejo Kolinsky 000 brush. So, brush chipping. It's a slow technique, my friends, not gonna lie. It takes a lot of time, but not as much as it would if we didn't use the sponge and speckling methods. Then we would have to paint everything in this slow dotting motion, but now we're just refining what we already have. Usually when I'm working like this, I start by outlining the edges where most wear is gonna be present. It also looks incredibly cool in my opinion, makes the shape, of the whole vehicle stand out. And once these are done, I adjust the shape and size on some of the sponge applied chips. We can also connect a random bunch of small flakes into one bigger chip, because variety is not only in their placement and shape, but also size. This effect can also be used to highlight textures or to visually separate different parts of the model. For example, it can create a nice divide between the camouflaged areas and the oxide primer. So technically, light color chipping isn't just, about chipping. It also serves the same purpose as dry brushing. This of course applies only to race details, but it creates the same highlighted effect, just more controlled and textured. And we're all about textures here. Also, I've been talking about light chipping the whole time without even explaining why it is like that. Like, what's the point in this light sandy color? Well, each paint coat in real life is a layer with certain thickness, right? Most, if not all the time, the paint has a surface finish that's slightly darker than what's underneath. And when this very top surface of the paint layer gets scratched, it reveals the lighter color underneath. Now, if you're presuming this also applies to the green and brown camouflage colors, you'd be right. But I believe there's a certain limit in these regular modeling scales. And also, painting light brown and green chips, then filling them with the base dark yellow, and filling that with the light yellow. Can you imagine how long that would take? And again, because of the scale, the result would be practically invisible, because the borders of each chip would be so tightly packed together. But maybe it might work in larger scales, like 1/16 and bigger. But here, just nah. So that's why I'm using the light yellow to chip everything. The only exception, of course, is the oxide primer. And because this area is very small, I wasn't able to chip it with a sponge and speckling, so I need to do all the heavy lifting with a brush. And yes, I'm using a pink color. Well, not totally pink, it's beige red from Vallejo. And, in my opinion, it's the best color for chipping oxide primer, don't add me in the comments. Alright, my fellow humans, we have the entire model covered with light chips. It really looks like it went through a war, which is kinda the whole point. And by now I can see this video is gonna be way longer than I wanted, so I apologize for that. I wanted to condense it into like 12 minutes, but there's just too much stuff we have to do tonight. And one of the things is steel chipping. The steel color will consist of 5 drops dark gray, 3 drops white, and 2 drops of dark yellow so it blends a little better with the surface. This time I also added 1 drop of tap water to the usual 5 drops of VMS retarder because Vallejo paints are quite thick. Needless to say, this step is the longest, most time consuming, sweat, tears, pain and gain inducing, but also the most rewarding. So the whole point is to fill the previously applied light chips. Not all of them of course, because there's just too many and some of them are very small. This of course means more variety, because painting inside all of them would just be too much. A huge advantage which I'll always appreciate as I'm painting is the light chips are acting as your guide and we don't have to think about elaborate combinations, shapes and places where the steel chips would look good. Because it's already all there, we just need to paint them inside the lighter ones. The whole trick of this two-layer chipping is to leave the light chip as an outline of the darker chip. Not only is the effect gonna look more three-dimensional, which I mention each time I'm making a chipping video, but also the dark gray chipping is actually gonna look like softer. It's hard to describe, but those chips painted on the dark yellow color, where the light chipping is not so evident, they're more like in your face, But having a light colored guide all over the model is nice and dandy, but it doesn't change anything with the fact this step requires far more precision and patience. And it's extremely slow. And while I was working on it, I had a lot of time to think, about 40 hours. And I've been coming up with some ideas for the next model. Well, spoiler alert, it's gonna be a modern vehicle, but that's not the point. At first, I was thinking about the no chipping challenge, which I mentioned in my very first series on YouTube. Hey, that actually sounds like a cool challenge for some future model. No chipping challenge. But then I thought nah, I'm gonna do some chipping anyway because it looks cool. But in a slightly different way. In fact, the entire weathering is gonna be done in a just very different way, so stay tuned for that. But hey, one of the ideas we'll explore more on the next model is the reverse chipping from VMS. I'm gonna try it a little here as well, so I mixed a medium gray color similar to the one used a moment ago, and I applied it generously with a sponge on the lower part of the model. The concept is very simple. You apply the paint in any way or amount you want, and then you remove what's unwanted. So far I didn't find the courage to chip the entire model this way, but I'm slowly getting the hang of the technique. The thing which has been preventing me from using it over the entire model is the application. Because, as you can imagine, the chances of hitting the light chips with a sponge are quite low compared to painting the chips meticulously with a paintbrush. But for example, here on the lower hull, I just quickly stippled the paint, then went over it with tap water, not even focusing on any particular chips, just letting the water to remove most of them, and then I finished it off with more refined chips painted with the Vallejo steel mixture. Extremely easy, and because of this, we'll explore this method in more depth on the next model. Anyway, while I had the steel color mixed, I decided to take full advantage of it and work more efficiently. I just made it one drop lighter and used it to paint all the usual details that are normally gray. This includes tow cables, ends of the gun cleaning rods, the engine starting crank, shell impacts, and periscopes. The previous details are meant to be in a raw steel finish, but periscopes were just grey, like painted grey. And although the dark grey color looks pretty metal on its own, I made it even lighter. And also diluted it with tap water and applied it randomly over the steel details to give them more visual texture. This is gonna pay off with the upcoming rust washes. And speaking of those, I'm again gonna work with the same ammo enamels like I normally do, but we're gonna start with the chipping effects. Here I'll be using the dark streaking rust effect on most of the tank because it's a very good looking rust color, especially once it's blended over the dark grey colored steel chips. The light rust wash is gonna provide more tonal richness on the oxide red primer parts, because here the dark rust zone would be completely invisible due to the primer color being very similar to rust. And this step is very relaxing compared to the previous ones, but again, it shouldn't be rushed because reckless application and blending will end up with a completely rusted out tank. So just take your time, apply just tiny amounts of rust over the largest chips, go one small section of the model at a time, and once they're dry to the touch, blend them with enamel thinner. Again, not by flooding the whole surface, but instead by gently tapping around each rust spot. Sometimes, especially on light colored vehicles, in this case on the yellow and green parts, the evaporating thinner will create a sort of stained effect. So you might need to go over the already blended rust zones one more time, but it's not a big deal and it also goes by very fast. As usual, I can understand why some modelers don't like adding rust on their armor models, because It's not entirely realistic when it's done in this amount, but as I said so many times already, I don't care. To me it looks very good and makes the model look more metal and authentic, even if it's not realistic. It's probably one of the best contradictions in modeling. This whole chipping effect also makes the surface more busy because suddenly there's something happening in every corner, and also a lot of it will get toned down with dust effects in the next episode. But that's again the point of weathering done in layers, and once the model is done, all these individual steps and painting techniques will create an intricate finish. Now it was time to finish the exhausts. They're quite small, so they can be painted in a very simple way. Because I already have them coated with basic colors, dark yellow on the lower half, and the pipe is actually unpainted white primer, I only had to add some chipping effects with a sponge and black-brown Vallejo paint. Unlike a dark gray chipping color, this will result in a more rusted out appearance. So then I added the rust zones the same way as on the tank, but only on the lower half, which has the dark yellow on it, while the rusted out pipe was covered with a heavy rust wash. Then I added more rust zones with speckling, again unloading the brush on a napkin so I'll get only tiny specks, and that's it. Done. Now they can be weathered with earth tones just like the rest of the model. The same rust wash treatment was also done on the remaining metal details. Their medium gray base coat will create a very authentic looking metal effect. Of course, they're gonna look like they've seen better days, but again, just like the exhausts, they'll be weathered with the same earth colors in the next video, and once these are in place and some graphite is rubbed over them, they're gonna look just mwah. Now for the impacts. Because I already base coated them with a gray color, the next step was to add the burned paint around them. Black-brown oil paint was used for this. We can also create this effect with an airbrush, but oil paints provide more control, and I wouldn't be very stoked if I accidentally overdid the effect with airbrushed acrylics. Then we can apply the same rust washes. I used more of the light rust wash to make the impacts look, fresher, and then back to acrylic paint and tiny chipping effects. This represents spalling created by torn bits of metal from the armor plate and the shattered armor piercing shell. That's why I'm painting them in this star-shaped pattern, to make it look like, if the shell just shattered on impact and the hot metal from the impact just splashed around it. Same thing with the dark steel chipping. Again, it's totally worth taking our time and making the chips as small as possible. And also the same with the dark rust enamel paint. Impacts, especially when they're painted with care, are such a cool detail. I'm not even gonna say cool little detail because they're clearly visible even from afar, but yeah, they look really cool and make the model look like it means some business. This time I also forgot to paint the fire extinguisher, so again it's the same medium gray like I used on the metal details, maybe a bit lighter, and just like with periscopes, this time it doesn't represent a metal surface, but just gray paint. And just like on the Tiger, I used the Alliance Modelworks decals, which are totally out of scale and don't fit on 1/35 scale extinguishers, they're more like 1/16 scale. But since I have them, I removed the lower third of the decal, and although technically not accurate, it looks really good. As you might already noticed, a lot of these steps are the same like I did on the Tiger. And that also applies to wooden parts. So these were base coated with Iraqi sand and old wood from Vallejo. I painted 2 rods with Iraqi sand and 1 with old wood on each side. And then I watered these paints down and brushed them on top in random lines, like wood grain texture. Again, this time I switched them around, so old wood on Iraqi sand base and Iraqi sand glaze on the old wood base. And because these are so close together, I actually managed to clog the tiny gaps between them, so I had to make a fake shadow with a dark brown wash. I mixed it from an oil paint and I used the same paint but straight from the tube to create some fake shadows around the clamps. This makes the wood more weathered and also adds additional detail to these parts. One of the final details were spare tracks. I already made a pretty detailed video about painting these things, link down below, but in this case I'll only create the rusty appearance and then I'll finish them with the rest of the model using earth tones and some more rust and grimy stains. So just like before, dark gray base color, followed up with a random wash of slightly lighter gray color, again acrylic, then a very heavy enamel rust wash using both colors, but again most of the surface is treated with the light rust wash and the streaking rust effect was only applied in a few spots. And then some rusty speckling to make the rust washes more opaque and give them a slightly grittier look. The excess speckling is easily removed from the model using enamel thinner, so just like with the light colored oil paint speckling, there's no need to mask anything. I painted the remaining spare tracks the same way, but because these are removable, the process was a bit easier. And the last step is gonna be carried out with a silver paint. This is the first time I'm trying these new AK 3rd generation acrylics and I can't give too many opinions because this is the only color I have. But it brushes much better than the silver Tamiya paint, but it isn't as shiny. Doesn't matter to me very much because I'm only using these paints for weld bead chipping. As we already know, weld beads don't rust, so they're always gonna have this shiny effect when they're chipped. Which is, I think, a very nice contrasting detail. And because this paint is much easier to apply with a paintbrush, I was able to carefully pick out only the protruding parts of the weld bead texture, so that's pretty cool. And that's it, my friends. When I think about how I was building the model, it feels almost like yesterday. And look at it now, it's all ready for mud and dust effects. So we're more than halfway done. There's a ton of work crammed into this video and seriously I spent like almost 2 weeks just painting all the stuff. So I spent 2 weeks altogether with video production and everything on one episode that's only gonna be relevant for a week. It's because, you know, I want to provide you with content that's valuable and isn't dragging on for too long. So I hope you like what you saw tonight. And in return, hit the like if you liked it, or dislike if you didn't like it, and leave a comment if you wanna say something. So the next episode will be all about dust and mud. We're also gonna put on the tracks, but the model won't be completely finished. I'm gonna leave some finishing touches for another video because now I need to catch up all the time I lost on this one. So what else is there to say? I bought a new camera, yeah, like a video recording device. But I'm still recording on the old one because I'm still waiting for a dummy battery so I can plug it in, you know, and don't lose time with battery charging. So I hope it'll arrive tomorrow or something because the video quality is gonna be sick. So, thank you my friends for watching, thank you to my amazing patrons who make this weekly show possible, and as I like to say all the time, I keep posting stuff to my Patreon all the time, so it's like a magazine subscription. There's stuff like almost daily updates from my workbench, 1 week early ad-free videos, so you'd be able to watch the next episode about mud and dust, super cool and big photos with a perfectly clean background like these, and also DMs so we can talk, and also a lot of info about all my models, like I discuss things like paint, tools, techniques, you know, you name it. So it's a good source of additional content and info to these videos, and again, I post there all the time, almost every day, so totally worth it if you're interested in more stuff. Anyway, that's all I got for you tonight, so make sure to drop by the next Friday for the Dust and Mud episode. I keep saying it all the time. Yeah, so drop by the next week, give the video a like if you liked it, or a dislike if it was no bueno, stay safe, take care of yourself, have a ton of fun with your models, and I'll see you mates in the next one. Cheers!